Hey guys, this is Cullen Moshman for CardShot.com. We're continuing on now with me and Katie's course, Become a Winning Poker Player in 30 Days. I love the topic of day 28 because it's risk aversion, exploiting it, handling it, and poker players love the "it depends" line. Personally, I think it's overused, and the reason for that is because obviously what you do is always going to depend on a lot of different factors. But one that is really interesting is the state of the tournament, because sometimes there's basically no impact at all, whereas sometimes it's going to completely change our strategy and have us do something that we never would at other states of the tournament. So the most basic is when everything is normal. Okay, so early in a multi-table tournament or MTTS&G, we're going to play pretty similar to a cash game. There's no real risk aversion. It's not going to impact our play. It's not going to impact our opponent's play. So there's no real adjustments to be made. Then there's some risk aversion when you're, say, early in a 9-man or deep in an MTT or MTTS&G. So there's definitely going to be an impact from ICM. You're going to be a little bit less inclined to flip and gamble, but nothing too major. Whereas some of the time, risk aversion completely dominates your decision making, both in terms of exploiting it in others and correcting for it yourself. So the most common examples here are going to be the bubble of any single table tournament. So 3 players left in a 6-max, 4 in a 9-man. Let's say you're playing 45-man where usually 7 people are paid, so with 8 or 9 left. Anytime you're at the final table, a final table bubble of a big multi-table tournament, these are situations where risk aversion is going to dominate. So how are you going to impact your strategy? Like we talk about in the text, we can divide up into short, mid, and big stacked. So the short stacked will face some effect. You can be a little bit tighter calling off your stack, but for the most part, you are slated to bust next as the short stack, and you don't want to fold into nothingness. You want to have a chance at finishing as the winner, or at least the top couple of spots, so you're not going to impact your play all that much. So the mid stack, you need to be incredibly tight calling it off. So you can still often shove or be the person who has fold equity and not change your range all that much. But if you're going to call it off, you need a very large edge to account for the fact that the short stacks are slated to bust next. So very important to play tighter there. And the big stack that is can exploit that in others. You should play looser, more aggressive, and pressure opponents. And it doesn't matter so much who your opponents are. Like if it's a complete maniac, maybe you can't pressure them. But one thing to keep in mind is that even if you're up against a bad player who can't articulate anything about ICM or equity, and the fact that as a mid-stack you have a lot of equity that you don't want to go to waste by busting before the short stacks, they're still going to sense the intuitive correct adjustment to make. So let's say, for example, that I'm very mid-stacked on the bubble of a 9-man, and someone else only has 1 big blind. Well, I'm going to see that I don't want to bust before this player. I want to finish ITM. I'm going to tighten. So you can typically apply this against all player types. Now, one thing that's really important is that this applies equally when we're talking about deeper stack poker as well as shove fold. So let's say that we have a 30 blind stack and we're the big stack, okay? So in that case, we're going to be playing a lot of pots. We're going to be min-raising, attacking a lot post-flop. Whereas let's say we're playing a hyper-turbo format and we're the big stack, and the effective stack now, though, is only 12 blinds. Well, in that case, we're going to apply the same idea, but to shove a lot wider instead of min-raise a lot wider. So we'll look at examples of that. But first, I want to talk about one bonus concept that Katie and I don't go into in the book, but is important to be aware of, which is that typically whatever kind of situation you're in is going to perpetuate. So what I mean by that is, let's say that you're a mid-stack player at the bubble. A lot of the time what's going to happen is the big stack will continue to shove over and over, raise over and over, and the short stack won't bust, and you just kind of dwindle. Whereas the big stack is going to have more and more opportunities, going to open more and accumulate more and more chips. And what that means is that if you have the opportunity to become the big stack, that's going to pay a continuing dividend. Okay, so it won't just be you become the big stack and therefore you have higher equity from those added chips and from the stack distribution, it'll be that you continue to win more and more chips on average because you're going to have more and more profitable opportunities to open and pressure your opponents. So one way that you can use that is if it's a close spot, and if you fold, you're going to be a mid stack, but if let's say, for example, the big stack is raised and you're considering a 3-bet shove. And if you succeed in that 3-bet shove, then you're going to take over the chip lead. Well, if it's at all close, take that 3-bet shove. Okay, top players are going to go after the chip lead because they know that if they get it, they're going to have more and more profitable opportunities to exploit risk aversion. So with that said, let's take a look at today's hands. And one change that we're going to make relative to the way we normally look at hands is we're going to look at hands in succession. Okay, so first we're going to look at several hands that occurred in the same 9-man bubble, and then we're going to look at several hands that occurred during the same MTT final table. So the hands themselves aren't all back-to-back, but they all take place in the same situation. So here, how would you classify Hero? Answer, of course, is that he's the short stack, so his play isn't going to change all that much. So with 17 blinds here, I would just be playing relatively normal. We raise the king 10 and c-bet the flush draw. So this is going to be a spot, whereas the short stack, we're not going to make big adjustments. Now Hero has won a flip and doubled, and now we should be playing very differently. So here we are the big stack, and the player in the big blind is tied for the second chip lead, okay? So he's a mid stack. The player in the cutoff is the short stack with 11 blinds, and that means that we should be much looser and much more aggressive. And typically in this spot, you should never fold. You should play all hands, and you have a choice for how to do that. Here with the ace-4 offsuit, this hand does not play all that well post-flop, so I would tend to just shove in here for 17 blinds. And also, if you were to limp or raise small, a good player can then shove on you, and he'll be the one to have fold equity. So against a good player, you want to mainly be shoving here so you can be the one who has fold equity. Whereas if the big blind is a very weak player, then you can raise small, limp stab, and take a more small ball line. But against the vast majority of opponents, you should play all hands here to pressure the mid stack when you're the big stack. So first, let's see what Hero does. He comes in with a small raise. Again, normally I'd shove, but that works out well here. And now what we can do is we can say, what is the range that software generates? And in order to do that, we typically, the last time that we looked at ranges, we did them what's called chip EV ranges, which are going to be if there's no payout structure, winner take all. And in our earlier slide, when we talked about when there's no risk aversion, then those are going to be the appropriate ranges. But here we've put in 9-man, so this is going to be 50, 30, 20 payouts. And what we can do is we can say, what is the range that we are supposed to shove? And in 9-man payout structure, it's any 2 cards. Okay, we're supposed to, if we're playing shove fold, shove all hands because of the fact that the big blind has to call with such a tight range. So for that reason, we go ahead and we're super aggressive here as the big stack. Now this is another situation where big stack versus second big stack. So we want to pressure the player in the small blind. And we can do that in a couple of ways. So one thing is we can shove in for 18 blinds. There's an ante, not a terrible risk-reward ratio. So a lot of hands I would just shove here. If I had ace-4 offsuit, I would jam it. If I had pocket deuces, I would shove it. Against a weak player, we might also raise small. We might raise, let's say we have a hand like 9-4 suited. We could put out a raise to 550. If he folds, that's great. If not, we're going to pressure him post-flop. So look to put a ton of pressure on your opponents in these spots. See how this one plays out. Hero checks. And we flop pretty strong, open and straight draw. Now we have top pair. And Hero calls, so this is reasonable considering that we have, substantial showdown value with top pair. River, we're going to value bet with their top pair. Hero checks back. So Hero plays this entire hand very passively. We want to be applying maximum pressure in these spots. Here's another one. What should we do? Well, the player on the button has a 12 blind stack. So we have fold equity if we can three bet shove. And that's what we should do here with the pseudo Broadway hand. We have a hand that's inside of the magic range. If the button had shoved, we would have to fold. When he min raises, we can 3-bet shove and have fold equity. So that's what Hero should do here. So what we've seen is that Hero has navigated this bubble by playing it too tight and should look to accumulate chips more and take advantage of his chip lead. Now let's see if Hero in the MTT does a better job. So we're going to look at him having a couple of relative stack sizes. So right now we would classify him as, of course, the big stack. He has a 50 blind stack, and the next biggest stack is the big blind, who has a few blinds less than him. Now, another thing that's really important is it works in our favor that the short stacks are out of the hand. Okay, so the two shortest stacks are going to be the two players to our right. They folded, so now it's us versus the mid stacks. And for that reason, we should widen up quite a bit. So I know Hero's game. Hero would never normally open 10-4 suited in the cutoff. And I guarantee you the reason he's doing that is because he wants to pressure the mid stacks as the big stack. So you can take this too far. Okay, if you're raising here a complete chunk hand, like let's say 3 deuce off, you're probably taking this concept too far. But unless the players to your left are super loose and playing back at you all the time, this is going to be a solid open as the big stack. And here the small blind does 3-bet us. I wouldn't do anything further besides fold, but still a good open that should win chips. Now we're going to get to a slightly more advanced hand. Hero is a mid-stack at this point, and not only that, but it's super interesting because the small blind is a really short stack. He only has 7 blinds. So I want you guys to think here, what should we do? Okay, the big stack has 3-bet us. What concepts apply here? This is not going to be the quiz question, but I still want you to think about it because it's very interesting and gets you thinking about the right topics here. So let's imagine that the big blind is a very good, strong player. In that case, he knows that he can pressure us. He's the big stack. We are the mid stack. The small blind is super short. This is a wonderful spot to pressure us. So he could be on a very wide range for 3-betting us. And for that reason, we should 4-bet shove. We've got fold equity. He's on a very wide range for making the 3-bet. So we should go ahead and shove against him. Whereas, let's say he's a very passive and weak player. Then he probably has a strong hand. He's probably not trying to exploit risk aversion. And if he, is on a very tight range, we don't want to get involved in all in here, with there being only a 7 blind stack who's already folded. So we might just make a very tight fold. So again, what I would do generally here is going to be to 4-bet shove because it's such a good spot for the big blind to 3-bet us and we have fold equity, but it does depend. Hero instead elects to call, has to give up at the flop. So normally by calling, we're just delaying a difficult decision until the flop. So now we've skipped ahead a little bit, and here with the ace-5 offsuit, these are some of the trickier decisions that we're going to face because we're mid-stacked, and the big stack in the small blind, if he's a good player, he's going to jam on us very wide if we raise because he knows that as a mid-stack, we're going to have to call very tight. So what we should normally do is put out a small raise anyway. We're going to raise fold against both players in the blinds. But if the player in the small blind is a strong opponent who's 3-betting us all the time, then we need to tighten the range of hands that we open, and we could fold a hand as strong as ace-5 offsuit on the button, which is what Hero does here. So this is another example. Here we have the ace-8 offsuit, and all of our options are on the table. We could actually go ahead and shove this hand for 23 big blinds. And here are limps, which is a good line as well. But the big blind jams on us. And this is a really strong play that he's making. This is big stack versus mid stack, and that allows you to make plays that don't have as good a risk-reward ratio. You wouldn't make as much because you have a lot of fold equity here. So strong play by the big blind, forcing Hero to fold a very strong hand, blind versus blind. And same again. And now this is more extreme. Now we have 20 blinds. The cutoff is 9 blinds. And the player in the big blind is attacking us relentlessly. So the morals here are that when you're Hero, you're going to have no choice but to tighten up a lot against a strong opponent who has the chip lead, one to your left, while the short stack is still around. And if you're the big stack, you want to be doing what this guy is doing. Now in this instance, I think Hero makes an incorrect adjustment, because the key difference here is that this is not us calling off our stack. The cutoff is min raise, and we have a very playable hand. So here what I would do is I would call and take a flop. If we flop top pair or better, or a very strong draw, we can check raise all in, we can fold otherwise, but because we don't have to call off our stack, I would go ahead and defend the big blind here. Now we have a 17 blind stack, and we know that if we min raise or if we limp, the small blind is likely to attack us. But Hero instead open shoves, and I like this play a lot. We probably have good, or we certainly have good fold equity. The small blind is not going to call it off wide here, so I like this shove, and I think this is a very good play. Remember, as the mid stack, you have to be very tight calling it off. So if somehow the small blind had moved all in against us, we couldn't call it off with the ace-8 suited, but when we have fold equity, we can still shove here. So now the short stack has busted, and Hero is the new short stack. So now things are pretty much back like normal, and Hero elects to shove 17 blinds with this king-9 suited, which is a good play. But again, we're back to normal as the short stack. So Hero has been all stack sizes and overall navigated this very well, with the exception of a couple of tight plays, such as folding the jack-8 suit in the big blind and just calling the 3-bet with the ace-queen off. So now what I want to do is I want to go back to one hand from the 9-man bubble, and it's going to be today's quiz question. So again, back on this 9-man bubble for players left. Cutoff folds, and my question to you guys here is, what is our play on the button with the 9-5 suited? Pause the video, come up with your answer, decide why you're going to make that play. And the correct answer here is that you need to shove this hand. This is a very clear shove. You are the big stack, the short stack is already folded, there are 2 mid stacks left to act, and you should jam super wide in the spot. So if we look at what the range is that we're supposed to be on, this is going to be a very wide one. I'm going to move it so that you guys clearly see this box, which shows the profitability of different hands. 9-5 suited plus 0.47, that's going to be percent of prize pool figure, and all of these hands are profitable to shove. Now, some of the time, you're going to be up against opponents who are calling you too wide, and a hand like 3-deuce offsuit, you know what, it's fine to fold. If you have a hand that when you get called, you're going to be in terrible shape, it's okay to fold if you're up against players who you think might call too wide. But a hand like 9-5 suited has very good post-flop potential, so even when you get called by a hand like pocket 8s or ace-king, it's a very live hand. And what that means is that you should definitely go ahead and shove here as the big stack into mid stacks. So super important, and these are going to be some of the absolute most profitable spots in tournament poker. So tomorrow we're going to continue on with one more strategy concept, which is another very cool one on floating. And in the meanwhile, thanks very much for watching. This has been Colin Moshman on behalf of Katie Dozier and the CardsChat.com course, Become a Winning Poker Player in 30 Days.